So the next section is from 8.3, which talks about ATP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's basically the molecule that all living things use as an energy source. It's like the batteries that we recharge to power our cells and to power all things that our cells do. So, starting off, your cells do three main kinds of work: chemical work, transport work, and mechanical work. So chemical work means, chemical work is making endergonic reactions happen that wouldn't naturally happen. So this is like building glucose during photosynthesis, or moving things up their concentration gradient across the cell membrane. Those are all endergonic processes that the cell, that would be transport. Chemical work would be building the anabolic pathways, endergonic reactions. Transport work would be moving things against a concentration gradient, like across the cell membrane, or anything like that that requires energy. And lastly, mechanical work would be contraction of muscle cells. So if you're like flexing or running, or that all requires ATP, which is what you need to eat to be able to exercise. And most of the time, your cells are going to be doing something called energy coupling, which is when your cells combine an exergonic reaction, so one that releases energy, and they have another reaction happen right next to it to grab that energy and use it to power it for an endergonic reaction. So that way, we're not doing extra work. Our exergonic reactions can power our endergonic reactions. And most of the endergonic reactions, energy coupling that happens inside of your cells is mediated by ATP. Wanted to double check what that said. ATP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So it has an adenosine, has 3 phosphates. You can tell a lot from the name. And it has ribose, adenine, and 3 phosphates. So if it has ribose and adenine, you should know or be able to tell that it's a nucleic acid. It's an RNA molecule. It just so happens to store so much energy that we use it for energy. It is easily an exergonic reaction. So here's what it looks like. We have our ribose in the middle, our 5-carbon sugar. Then we have adenine right here. Remember, adenine is a purine, so it has 2 rings. And then over here is our 3 phosphate groups. Normal adenine molecules, or that we would talk about, normal nucleotides only have 1, but this guy has 3, adenosine triphosphate. And what happens when the exergonic reaction that ATP undergoes is the releasing of a phosphate molecule. So we see 3 here. 1, 2, 3. 3 phosphates. It's going to let one of them go through a hydrolysis reaction. Remember, we put in water to break up molecules, and when we make molecules, we get water out. So this is a hydrolysis reaction where we lose a phosphate group. Now, as this molecule leaves, the reason why it's called inorganic phosphate is because, remember, organic molecules are things that have carbons and hydrogens. So when it leaves, it's not really attached to an organic molecule anymore, and it's not really an organic molecule anymore once it leaves. So it's an inorganic phosphate. And then what we have left over is adenosine diphosphate, ADP. Now we have 2 phosphates instead of 3. Di means 2, tri means 3. And we get energy when it happens. So that's really important. Here we see that again. And so the bonds right here, I can't see where I'm pointing. The bonds right here can be broken by hydrolysis, which we see. We put in water in the process of hydrolysis, and we get 2 molecules out, an inorganic phosphate and an ADP. And that's when the energy is released, when we release that phosphate group. And so the release of energy does not actually come from the phosphate bonds itself, but from the change in free energy. So it was storing a lot of energy, and now it's not storing as much energy anymore. So it actually comes from shifting to a lower energy state, not from the phosphate. So, like I was saying before, we release energy through ATP when ATP gets hydrolyzed into ADP, and that energy can be utilized to push another reaction through, an endergonic reaction. So the hydrolysis of ATP is an exergonic reaction. It releases energy, as you can see right here. Energy is released. And then that energy that's free now in the cell, in the organism, wherever it is, can be put to work in in an endergonic reaction. So endergonic reactions need to absorb energy, and this can provide that energy. So this is how it works. Basically, if we wanted to convert glutamic acid to glutamine, two different amino acids, we would add glutamic acid and ammonia. Okay, so that would happen. That is an endergonic reaction, so it has a positive delta G, and it's not going to happen on its own because it's not spontaneous because delta G is positive. Okay, it needs to absorb 3.4 kilocalories per mole. But what happens is if we combine glutamic acid with ATP, ATP gets hydrolyzed, it loses its phosphate. This phosphate comes and binds to the glutamine, or the glutamic acid, and we call this the phosphorylated intermediate. To phosphorylate something is to give it a phosphate group. So this glutamine has been phosphorylated, and now it's really unstable. And so what happens is it is so unstable that it wants to bind right away to this ammonia, and now we have glutamine. So it's the combination of the two reactions that tells you if it's going to happen or not. So overall, the delta G from these two reactants to products is 0.34 plus 0.34, and the delta G from ATP to ADP plus phosphate is negative 7.3. So if you combine them, we still have a negative net delta G. Because remember, it's not about what's happening in the reaction, it's about the actual change in free energy. So we're getting the same products and reactants as before we used ATP, so we can still talk about delta G in the same way. Right? So the reactants, if this is an exergonic reaction, endergonic, the making glutamic acid into glutamine is an endergonic reaction. So if you think back to this chart right here, sorry, this one on the bottom, it's endergonic. So here's the reactants. In both cases, glutamine and NH3 have the same amount of free energy, and at the end, they have the same amount of free energy. Oh, I'm sorry, that's backwards. This is the beginning. At the beginning, they have the same amount of free energy. At the end, they have the same amount of free energy, regardless of whether or not ATP was involved. So it's always going to be plus 3, 4. And ATP, ADP plus phosphate is always going to be minus 7.3. So if overall we still have a negative net delta G, then the reaction is going to happen. And it's going to be spontaneous. So, like I was just saying, here it is in words. ATP drives endergonic reactions by phosphorylation, which means it gives up its phosphate, it puts it on the other reactant molecule. And now this is our phosphorylated intermediate. So it's different than glutamic acid because now there's a phosphate group. So changing the chemical structure changes the structure of the molecule. Obviously, it's a different molecule now. So it's our phosphorylated intermediate. Sorry. So here's some other work that ATP can do. Here's ATP changing a transport protein. So we're going to talk more about this later, but basically input of ATP changes the structure of this protein and allows the solute to move across the cell membrane. Down here, this is a motor protein in a cell moving something along, and it's using ATP. But we'll get a lot more to that when we talk about things in the future. But it's really important to know that ATP is a recycled process. So when we transform ATP into ADP to get energy, it's not like that ADP molecule is done. It's going to be regenerated, and that ADP is going to have that third phosphate bonded back to it, so it'll turn back into ATP. So it's a big cycle, as you can see right here. So we start off with ATP, and we need water, remember, because this is a hydrolysis reaction to change into ADP plus phosphate, and that's when energy gets released to do cellular work, such as move something across the cell membrane, move a motor protein, change glutamic acid into glutamine. Those are all things that require energy, and they get them from the hydrolysis of ATP. Then down here, we have ADP and inorganic phosphate, and we need to put those back together to get more ATP. So what happens is that we need something that releases energy, such as an exergonic energy releasing process, like from your catabolism, like from photosynthesis, from cellular respiration, to take that ADP and bond it back to the phosphate to get ATP again. And so, like I said, the energy to phosphorylate ADP to turn it back into ATP comes from the catabolic reactions in the cell, most of which are cellular respiration. And when we get to cellular respiration, we're going to talk about how many ATP are made at each step along the way, because that's the whole point, to make energy for our cells. And so it says that the ATP cycle is a revolving door through which energy passes during its transfer from catabolic to anabolic pathways. So basically, Energy is stored in glucose, because that's what we'll use glucose for example, because that's where we get all our energy. Energy is stored in glucose, and then we want to use it to power something else. It needs to be transformed into ATP first to power an endergonic reaction, which would be an anabolic pathway. And that's 8.3.